The morning sun lay gentle over the frontier town, soft as a hymn, gilding the rooftops and catching in the tall spring grass that lined the road. But what happens when a peaceful morning is shattered by a child's desperate plea, and a man who has sworn off the world is forced to make a choice? Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what I have for you next, you won't want to miss. Jedediah rode slow through the main street, his broad frame easy in the saddle, the leather creaking beneath him. His eyes were distant, fixed not on the stores or the faces, but somewhere inward, where silence had become his only companion. He was a man most folks nodded to politely, but never invited close. A man of solitude, and he had grown accustomed to the hollow echo it left inside him. It was a small voice that broke the spell, shaky, urgent, and cutting sharper than any bullet. "Mister, please help my mama." His horse shifted under him, startled by the figure that darted into the road. A girl no higher than his waist, barefoot, tangled hair clinging to her cheeks, her eyes wide with a desperation that belonged on older faces. She stood there trembling, one hand outstretched as though her will could anchor him in place. He reined the horse sharply, dust swirling, and for the first time in years his heart jolted like it remembered how to run. "Please," she repeated, her voice cracking. "Mama ain't opened her eyes since last night." He dismounted in one smooth motion, boots sinking into the dust, his gaze lowering to hers. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low, rough from disuse. The girl pointed with a trembling hand toward the edge of town, where an old wagon leaned, half collapsed, its canvas torn like the belly of a shipwreck. He followed her, his long stride steady, though a knot had already gathered in his chest. Behind them, townsfolk paused in their doings, whispering under their breaths. Women at the mercantile door exchanged knowing looks. Men leaning against fence posts spat tobacco and muttered. Jedediah felt their eyes on his back, their judgment sharp as thorns. But the child's urgency allowed no room for hesitation. The wagon door hung loose on its hinge. Inside, dim light revealed the still figure of a young woman stretched upon a thin blanket. She looked scarcely more than a girl herself. Her skin was pale beneath bruises that told of fists and boots. A curl of dark hair stuck to her cheek where fever sweat had dried. Her chest rose shallowly, as though each breath was borrowed against some cruel debt. Jedediah crouched, his shadow falling across her. "This your mama?" he asked. The child nodded quickly, tears spilling, though she made no sound. She pressed her small body against the wagon wall, as if bracing for the world to collapse. He reached out, rough hands brushing her wrist, feeling for the faint rhythm of life. The pulse flickered weak but present. Relief hissed through his teeth. He looked once more at the girl, those wide waiting eyes, and saw that she had given him her last scrap of trust. "What's her name?" he asked softly. "Tabitha," the girl whispered. "I'm Ruth. I'm 5." Her smallness in saying it pierced him deeper than the bruises on the woman's body. He lifted his head, scanning the street. Some men had drawn nearer, curiosity dragging them like dogs to a carcass. One spat into the dust and muttered something about settler trash getting what's due. Laughter followed, sharp and mean. Jedediah rose to his full height, his shoulders broad enough to block their line of sight. "Best you mind your business," he said, his voice quiet but edged with iron. The muttering faltered. No one stepped closer. He bent again, sliding his arms beneath Tabitha's frail form. She weighed near nothing, a bundle of bones and bruises that made him grit his teeth. Her head lolled against his chest, breath ghosting faint and warm against his shirt. Ruth clung instantly to his coat as he lifted her mother free, small fingers knotting in the fabric like a drowning child clutching driftwood. The murmurs swelled as he stepped from the wagon. "Jedediah's lost his mind," someone hissed. "Ain't nothing but trouble." He had built his life on distance, on keeping others out where their weight could not press upon him. Yet here he was, bearing a stranger in his arms, with a child clinging to him as if he were already hers. The horse shifted uneasily when he mounted with the woman held against him. but he settled it quickly, one arm strong around her slight body. Ruth scrambled up behind him, small hands gripping his belt. The town blurred around them, faces half hidden, mouths whispering, eyes following as he turned the horse toward the open road. The air beyond the last building smelled of grass and pine, the wide prairie stretching soft and endless. Ruth pressed her face into his back, silent but trembling, while Tabitha lay unmoving, her breath a faint flutter against his chest. Jedediah urged the horse onward, each hoofbeat carrying them farther from the mutters of town and deeper into something he could not yet name. He had crossed a line from which there was no simple return, and as the prairie winds swept around them, Ruth's small voice whispered close to his back, fragile yet sure. "Don't let her go, mister. Please don't ever let her go." The words settled into him like a vow, unanswered, yet impossible to ignore. The prairie grass bent and whispered as Jedediah's horse carried them into the quiet stretch of land he called his own. The cabin rose from the earth with the wear of years upon its timbers, its roof patched where storms had tested it. No flowers framed the doorway. No voices ever filled its silence. It had been a long time since another soul had crossed its threshold. He dismounted, the horse exhaling as though relieved. Ruth slid down after him, her bare feet sinking into the damp grass, her eyes darting around with the wariness of a stray animal. Jedediah nudged the cabin door open with his boot and carried Tabitha inside. The air was cool and stale. He laid her gently on the bed, his own bed, a rough-hewn frame with a thin quilt. Her body sank into the mattress as though the straw inside could finally grant her a mercy she had been denied. He brushed damp hair from her face. A pulse still flickered beneath her skin, faint but steady. Ruth stood in the doorway, twisting her hands. "Is she going to die?" she asked, her voice small but piercing. Jedediah did not answer right away. He pulled a basin from the corner, filled it with water, and set it beside the bed. Only when he dipped a rag and pressed it gently against Tabitha's forehead did he turn to Ruth. "Not if I can help it," he said. His voice was rough, unused to promises, but the words felt heavier than any oath he had made before. The child crept closer, her wide eyes following his every move. "She said she was tired, then she wouldn't wake up. I shook her." She swallowed hard. She didn't even open her eyes. Jedediah looked at the girl fully then, and what he saw made his chest ache. A 5-year-old carrying the weight of fear that belonged to grown men. He crouched so his eyes met hers. "She's here still," he said softly, "and that means there's a chance." Ruth's throat bobbed as she nodded. She climbed onto the chair by the bed, placing her small hand over her mother's. Hours dragged like years. He fetched wood for the stove and boiled water for a thin stew of beans and salt pork. The smell filled the cabin, faint but steady. Ruth's stomach growled, but she said nothing until he placed a bowl in front of her. She ate quickly, then set half aside. "For Mama," she said. Jedediah nodded, though he knew Tabitha could not yet swallow. Still, he kept the bowl warm near the fire, as though hope itself could be ladled out when needed. When shadows lengthened, he caught Ruth staring at him. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "Men don't usually help." He leaned back, the chair creaking. Words did not come easily to him, but at last he answered, "Because no one else would." Tabitha stirred once in her sleep, a faint sound like a broken sigh. Ruth gasped, leaning forward, whispering, "Mama!" But Tabitha did not wake. Jedediah knew tongues would already be wagging in town. A man taking in a beaten woman, a child not his own. People would see it as folly, scandal, weakness. Yet standing by the bed, watching the fragile rise and fall of Tabitha's chest, he felt something quieter and stronger take root. Ruth curled against the chair, her eyelids heavy, but her small hand never left her mother's. Jedediah draped a blanket over her, his movements careful. He stepped outside into the cool night. Stars hung thick and low. He leaned against the rail, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called, and the sound lingered like a warning. He returned to the cabin and sat near the bed, his rifle within reach. In the hush of the night, Jedediah felt the cabin change around him. It was no longer the empty shelter of a solitary man, but a place where life now hung in the balance. The silence was no longer his. It belonged to them, fragile and uncertain, yet somehow binding him more than years of solitude ever had. And as the firelight flickered over Tabitha's still face, her lips parted ever so slightly, and a sound, half breath, half word, escaped. "Silas," she whispered. The name was a ghost in the room. Jedediah leaned forward, heart pounding, but she was gone again, pulled back under the tide of fever and sleep. Who was Silas? And why did the name sound like a curse on her lips? He sat motionless, waiting, every muscle strung tight as though the next breath might decide everything. The morning broke pale and uncertain, the prairie mist curling low over the grass. Jedediah stepped outside and scanned the horizon. The world was quiet, a quiet thick with waiting. He had barely returned inside when a sharp rap sounded at the door. Not a neighbor, not a passing rider. This was a demand. Ruth stiffened, clutching her mother's hand. Jedediah's gaze flicked to the rifle, then back to the door. With deliberate calm, he opened it. A man stood there, face shadowed by the brim of his hat, his stance wide with arrogance. It was Silas Blackwood, the sheriff. His lip curled when his eyes darted past Jedediah into the cabin. "You've taken her in," he said, his voice low, edged with contempt. "That woman, don't fool yourself. She brought this on herself. We gave her what she deserved." Jedediah's hand tightened on the doorframe until the wood creaked. He did not step aside. "You've said enough." His stillness carried a weight more dangerous than any shout. Blackwood spat into the dirt, eyes glittering. "You'll regret it. Women like her bring nothing but ruin." He leaned forward, hissing. "And men who take them in, ruin follows them too." Jedediah swung the door closed with a force that rattled the frame, shutting out the man's sneer. Ruth whimpered. Tabitha stirred faintly on the bed, a shadow of a sound escaping before her lashes fluttered shut. Jedediah moved quickly to her side. "Rest now," he said, his voice thin with effort. "You're safe." But safe was a fragile promise, one he knew could splinter with the next knock on the door. That night Ruth woke screaming. Jedediah sat at the edge of the bed, his shadow large against the wall, and spoke low until her sobs quieted. She whispered that she was afraid they'd come back. He did not lie to her. He only said, "I'll be here." In those 4 words he laid down a shield stronger than iron. Days crept on. Tabitha fought her way back from the fog, her eyes opening longer each time, though shame clung to her gaze like a second skin. She spoke little. When Jedediah offered food, she whispered apologies, as though survival was a burden. He answered not with words but with actions. The town, however, did not stay silent. At the mercantile, Jedediah caught the stares, the smirks. "He's ruined what little standing he had," they muttered. One evening, Tabitha tried to slip from the cabin. He found her on the porch, her legs unsteady. Ruth clung to her skirts, tears streaking her face. "I can't stay," Tabitha whispered, her voice breaking. "I've brought nothing but trouble. He doesn't deserve—" Jedediah stepped forward. Without a word, he took the shawl from her trembling hands and wrapped it firmly back around her shoulders. He gestured toward the doorway, toward the bed, toward the bowl waiting on the table. He said nothing, but the message was clear. She looked at him, her lips trembling, then let Ruth lead her back inside. The days took on a new rhythm. Ruth's laughter began to stitch life back into the place. Tabitha, still weak, sat in the doorway, her eyes lingering on him, trying to understand. One evening, he placed a small carved wooden horse on the table. Ruth's eyes lit up. She ran to her mother, showing it off with pride. And for the first time, Jedediah saw Tabitha's lips curve in the faintest, uncertain smile. But shadows gathered quick. Near dusk, while Jedediah chopped wood, riders appeared on the ridge. 3 men, Silas Blackwood and 2 of his deputies. They watched from their saddles, their faces dark with intent. Jedediah felt their eyes burn across the distance. He returned their gaze without flinching, the axe still in his hand, his posture calm but unyielding. After a long moment, the men turned their horses and vanished. When he entered the cabin, Tabitha looked at him with fear wide in her eyes. She had seen them too. Ruth clutched the wooden horse close. Jedediah closed the door, sliding the bar across with deliberate care. In the heavy silence that followed, Ruth's voice trembled. "They're coming back, aren't they?" Jedediah did not answer. His hand only tightened on the rifle by the wall, his jaw set as the night pressed closer. The prairie lay beneath a heavy dusk, its horizon burning with the last embers of daylight. Jedediah stood on the porch, rifle resting against his shoulder. His gaze was locked on the wavering line of riders drawing closer. Their silhouettes moved like shadows uncoiling from the earth, slow, deliberate, certain. Behind him, through the thin walls, he could hear Ruth whispering to her mother, her voice high with fear. Each word pressed against his chest. The horses stopped short of the fence. 3 men fanned out. Sheriff Blackwood sat in the center, his face carved hard. "You've got no claim to her," he called, his voice sharp as a whip. "You think taking in a ruined woman makes you righteous? You'll learn soon enough it makes you weak." Jedediah said nothing. He let the silence stretch. The barrel of his rifle glinted faintly as he shifted it. Blackwood smirked. "She belongs where she came from. Cast out. Step aside, farmer, and we'll take her off your hands." Behind the window, Ruth's small face appeared, pressed against the glass. Tabitha sat up weakly on the bed, her body trembling. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He spoke at last, his voice low, even. "She's not yours. She's not leaving." The men laughed, an ugly sound in the twilight. One dismounted, his hand brushing the grip of his revolver. The other 2 shifted, circling like wolves. Jedediah stepped down from the porch, the earth firm beneath his boots. He held the rifle loosely, but the line of his shoulder spoke louder than steel. "Best you turn around," he said. "This land's mine, and so is the right to choose who stands on it." Blackwood sneered, gesturing toward the cabin. "You'll ruin yourself for her, a beaten woman with nothing left to give. Think of what you're staking. Your name. Your life." Jedediah did not answer with words. He leveled the rifle, not with fear, but with the calm of a man who had lived long with ghosts and had little left to lose. The click of the hammer being cocked was louder than the cicadas in the grass. The dismounted man froze. For a long, taut moment, no one moved. The prairie wind slipped between them. He could hear Ruth beginning to cry behind the glass. At last, Blackwood spat, though the bravado in his eyes had dulled. "You'll regret this," he said, pulling his horse back. "We'll not forget." His words trailed on the wind like a curse as they retreated into the dark. Jedediah did not lower the rifle until they were gone. Only then did he step back onto the porch, his shoulders sagging. Inside, the firelight flickered, but fear clung thick as smoke. Ruth ran to him, her arms tight around his waist. "I was so scared," she whispered. He crouched, setting the rifle aside. "I told you I'd be here," he said, his voice quiet but certain. Tabitha watched from the bed, tears she could not hold back shining in her eyes. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "They'll come back. They'll bring more. You'll be ruined because of me." Jedediah rose slowly, his eyes steady on hers. "They'll come back or they won't. Either way, you're not going anywhere." She shook her head, shame darkening her gaze. "I don't deserve this. I've only brought you trouble." He stepped closer. He did not speak. Instead, he reached for the kettle, poured water into the bowl and set it at her side. The simple gesture carried more than any argument ever could. Ruth climbed onto the bed, nestling against her mother's side. The carved wooden horse clutched to her chest. Tabitha drew her close, her tears falling into her daughter's hair. Jedediah turned away, tending the fire, but his presence filled the room like a shield. Later, when the cabin had gone quiet, Tabitha whispered into the dimness. "My husband. He found something in the sheriff's ledgers. Something about the railroad land grants. Blackwood was stealing parcels, selling them back to the railroad under false names. The confession hung in the air, a secret that had cost a man his life. Blackwood found out, he knew. That's why they beat him. It wasn't just a saloon brawl, it was murder." Jedediah's hand tightened on the rifle's stock. It all made sense now. The threats, Blackwood's fury. It wasn't about Tabitha's honor. It was about her silence. "He thought I had the proof," she whispered. "The original pages from the ledger. But I don't. I swear I don't know where he hid them." Outside, the prairie lay in darkness. The night wind carried the distant echo of hooves. Jedediah's gaze lingered on the fragile peace within the walls. This wasn't just about protecting a woman and her child anymore. It was about justice. Dawn crept soft across the prairie. Inside the cabin, the air held its breath. Jedediah sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees. Tabitha stirred, and when her eyes opened, they were clearer than he had yet seen. Ruth, curled beside her, slept with her small fist still clenched around the wooden horse. Tabitha pushed herself up, her face pale but touched with a fragile strength. Her eyes sought Jedediah's, as though weighing whether he was real or some dream. "You've kept us here," she whispered, "when you should have turned us away." Jedediah rose, the boards creaking under his weight. He crossed to her side, adjusting the quilt over her shoulders. "I've lived a long time with nothing but silence," he said quietly. "Since you came, there's been something more. I don't want to lose that." Her lips parted, trembling. "You can't mean—" His voice thickened. "I do. I've found myself watching you breathe, listening for your voice, waiting for the sound of Ruth's laughter. I've lived years without any of it, and I don't want to go back." He paused, his hands resting over hers. "I love you, Tabitha. I reckon I didn't expect it, but it's the truth." Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from something that stole the breath from her chest. She lifted a hand, tentative, and touched his arm. "No one's ever wanted me for more than shame. Not until now." The moment hung fragile between them until Ruth stirred and opened her eyes. Seeing them close, her small smile broke like sunlight through a cloud. She whispered, drowsy but sure, "We can stay forever, can't we?" Jedediah looked at her, then back to Tabitha. "Forever," he said, the word a vow spoken as steady as the rising sun. But forever had a price. The next day he found the ledger pages. Tabitha's husband had hidden them in the false bottom of the old wagon. Proof of Blackwood's crimes right there in his hands. They had a choice. They could burn the papers and run, hoping to disappear before Blackwood's obsession found them again. Or they could ride back into town and face the devil himself. They rode at dawn. Jedediah, Tabitha, and little Ruth. A family forged in violence, now riding toward a reckoning. They didn't ride to the sheriff's office. They rode to the church. It was Sunday. The town was gathered. When they walked in, a hush fell over the congregation. Blackwood was in the front pew, his face a mask of fury. Jedediah didn't speak to the sheriff. He spoke to the town. He laid the ledger pages on the altar for all to see. He told them of the land fraud, of the murder of Tabitha's husband, of the threats against an innocent woman and child. Tabitha stood beside him, her head held high, her voice clear as she confirmed every word. The townspeople looked from the ledger to their sheriff, and they saw the truth in his panicked eyes. Blackwood went for his gun, but he wasn't fast enough. Jedediah was faster. The shot echoed in the silent church. Blackwood crumpled to the floor, his reign of fear over. When the dust settled, the town wasn't looking at Jedediah with suspicion anymore. They were looking at him with respect. And they looked at Tabitha not as a ruined woman, but as a survivor who had brought a tyrant to justice. The prairie stretched endless, its silence no longer hollow but full with promise. To you who listen, let this truth settle in your heart. Sometimes love does not come with thunder or triumph, but in the quiet mercy of a hand that does not let go. Hold fast to those small mercies, for they can remake a life. If you believe that courage can bring light to the darkest corners, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming.